But this message, our liberation in God, is a continuation of what I did in Hot Springs a couple of weeks ago, which I was well received. Some of the quotes on here that I have, by the way, before I go much further, yes, hello from Tulsa. And they do, and Art does say, I don't know if the camera thinks what I should be saying this to, but Art does say thank you to everyone for the prayers. He's stabilizing. So we'll talk about that more at prayer time, but just saying that his sister did say, publicly announce that the churches you're going to, yes, it's helping a lot because he is stabilizing. So and prayer does work. We got Rick here. I don't know how that chainsaw went, 50 feet away from you and still was, huh?
53 feet.
53 feet. He knows exactly how.
Straight.
It was 52 last time I heard.
Well, it's 50, no, maybe 54.
Are we going 55, 55?
53.
Give me 60.
60?
They always get their stories bigger and bigger.
So we know that prayer does work, and like I say, Art still having hard times, but he is feeling much better. And I'll mention the other prayer requests later on something else, which most of us already know about, because I publicized it and is not on Facebook because I refused to do that. I felt that for his family that was not cool. You know, some people didn't matter. Art didn't like Facebook either, so he wouldn't want that. Now, as I was going to say, our liberation in God is the title of this message. And I have 4 quotes. I'll just make them quick. I had them last week and they were pretty good. Freedom. Okay, one of them is by Gandhi, which me and Ian and I were actually discussing Gandhi, about how he had a profound effect on history, which you can read up later. Freedom is not worth having if it does not include the freedom to make mistakes. And God allows us to make mistakes. This week with the heat, I made my mistakes. Of course, my bosses made mistakes, and I think we all made mistakes. But we learn from our mistakes. I was reading up on that and realized that if by making mistakes and we know them, then we can learn not to do them, or we start. Yeah. Anyway.
That was a mistake.
That was a mistake? See? The next one is Eleanor Roosevelt. Freedom makes a huge requirement on every human being. With freedom comes responsibility. For a person who is unwilling to grow up, the person who does not want to carry his own weight, this is a frightening prospect, which I'll just let you think on that yourself. But freedom does have a lot of responsibilities. I'll just interject this here. Mark Twain, he had the freedom to go to the territories, like Nevada Territory. And like I said one time, and I'm not going to repeat it too much, just I thought it was interesting. He bought a horse without having a license. He rode a horse without having a license. He was boondoggled in the story, but he was able to get the horse. And $30 for a horse sounded pretty cheap. I was like, wow. And the next one is by Burke. But what is freedom without wisdom and without virtue? It is the greatest of all possible evil. For it is folly, vice, and madness without intuition or strength. So yeah, you got to have wisdom with your freedom. And last one, liberty is not the power to do what we would like, but the right to do what we ought. So we should do what we ought to. And God does give us this freedom because we were told to keep the holy days. He gives us freedom to keep it or not. Like my mom, I was talking to someone. She got to know the truth, but she thought that she loved everything. She even knew she was going to sleep when she passed away. But when it came to the holy days, it's like, oh, it's an inconvenience. I was like, why? You're retired, Mom. You can do whatever you want. Heck, I could even help you get a room if you want. But she didn't want to hear it. Jesus talks about liberty. If y'all wouldn't mind turning to Luke 4:16 through 21. I think I got the right scripture there. 16 through, there we go. I won't read 16 because we already know the basics of the story. He came to Nazareth where he was brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath. They handed him the book of Isaiah, and then he turned to it and he said, the Spirit, then he goes off and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he appointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent to me to proclaim release to the captives, and recover the sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. And I think in one version it says the liberty or something like that. But he came to liberate us. He came to proclaim the gospel to those who are in captivity. And then he said, he closed the book and gave it to the attendant and sat down, in the eyes of the whole congregation, or in this case synagogue, was upon him. And I've been reading the synopsis of the Gospels, and he at that moment was still doing this, because you see him, like in one case, a centurion comes up to him. I know he's mentioned him, and I just ran into the story. And the centurion just says, "Hey, you're a captain of a host. You can just say the word. Go send him out." So he had a ailing, I think it was a servant, if I remember correct, who was dying or was very sick. I know he took care of Peter. They went to Peter's house. His wife was sick, and Jesus Christ healed him. And he forgave the sins, which caused contention with the Jewish leadership, because they were going, really? But yeah. We also know in John 8:31 through 32. In John 8:31 through 32. So Jesus was saying to those Jews who believed him, "If you continue in my word, then you are truly my disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And then they go on and ask the question, what is the truth? But he was there to give us the truth. He was the Word. He became physical. He was going to liberate us. And he's liberated us in many ways. I'm not going to go into the whole handout, but it talks about like sin in Romans. He's freeing us from sin, as it says on there. God frees us from sin. In Romans 6:17 through 19. On the handout it says, "And having been set free from sin, you become servants or slaves of righteousness." So we're set free from our sins, which is a big deal because they plague us. Because I know that sometimes I've known people who have done something wrong and cannot forgive themselves and won't go to God or anything, and then it just plagues them for their life. If you go to God, you know He's forgiven you, and you do your best to correct it. And you follow Him. Paul addresses this as well. "For you, brethren," Galatians 5:13 through 16. Galatians 5:13 through 16. And this one gives a little bit of a warning too. It says, "For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." So we may be liberated, but that doesn't mean we can just do whatever we want. We, like one of the quotes says, that the last one, but the right to do what we ought to. So we've been liberated. Now, for the rest of this, I'm going to focus on the world. Because last week when I was in Hot Springs, I talked about a personal level. I'll just synopsis it real quick. I talked about how, for example, we've been liberated from sin. Because now, even though we sin, we can go to Jesus Christ as our advocate. 1 John, I think it's 2:1 through 2, says that we have an advocate we can go to, and he will be there to hear us and forgive us and all that. We are released from death. of all things we're released from death, or from the fear of death, which, by the way, we've had a death in the Tulsa church. If you didn't know, Reggie Nolans, he passed away. But now he's free. He's not free of death, but he's free from this life to rest. But he will someday hear that seventh trumpet, and he will be with us again, just like Gary will be, like Tom Justice, Mr. Noble, and you can just mention a bunch of names. It's going to be a big family get-together when all that happens. As I was telling him, I can see Mr. Justice coming to me before he shakes my hand and says, "You actually made it. You're an honorary 19-year-old. How did you make it?" Oh, a lot of work for God. That's all I can say. A lot of work for God. So, because he was a jokester, so I can really honestly see him doing that actually before he did. He give me a big hug. We see in Jesus' own words that we are not of this world once we accept him. In John 15:18 through 19. Now, I'll read mostly off the handout, but you can go ahead and turn to it to get the context. But in John 15:18 through 19. Yet because you are not of this world, I have chosen you. King James. I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. The world didn't like him. Like I said, they crucified him. And it wasn't just the Jewish people. The world would not have accepted him. Look at the world today. If he preached what he preached today, they would be doing the same thing to him. The world's upside down. We're calling good evil and evil good. Can't win for losing. But we're called out of the world, and as he said, I chose you out of the world. He's freeing you from it. In Romans 2, Paul addresses this again. Romans 12, 1 through 2. Just turn to that one. This one's a little bit harder too, because I was listening to a podcast by Julie and don't advertise them. Point is, I was listening to Julie and Dennis, and they were talking about how today I don't have my cell phone on me, but there's something called Twitter, which I would not mind utilizing in its proper form, for the gospel. But there are people. Julie's 22 years old. She was talking about her people. Just before I get into this scripture, they would get on there and they would look up I don't know, how to do pottery, whatever. Twitter is geared to give you video after video after video from pottery, cats, whatever, and you could be on there for hours and hours and hours and waste a lot of time. And it actually, besides wasting your time, can also influence you. Computers and all do that. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, depending on how it goes. In verse 1 of Romans 12, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your body a living sacrifice acceptable to God, which is spiritual service of worship. This is where I was going, verse 2. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. As we know, the world is battling for our minds, because like you said, you can turn on TV and the shows I used to watch I thought were so innocent. Some of them weren't really as innocent as I thought they were. I'm not saying they were bad, but there was a couple of things when you really look at the nuances of what they were trying to show me. It was you could tell they were influencing. So but where we get to see what's acceptable to God is what's in this Bible. We study it like we're doing today. We have our weekly class here today on the Sabbath, where we get together and hear the Word, read and study. You do it at home, like I'm doing now when I read Jesus' words, or whatever you do to study. I know somebody who reads Psalms every morning. And if he's in a rush, he'll just read the first 5 verses and then go to work and think about what David or whoever was saying and meditate it and really internalize it. I thought that was pretty cool. He told me that one day. was reference to. And as we know, this whole mess started off with in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3, 1 through 18. I'm not going into that, or he did a sermon on it, but you know this all started with that. It was a mistake. They're out there doing their thing. They listen to this being, say a serpent, whatever you want to say, and they get told to do something against God, which was, you would think they thought was minor, didn't realize. And that's a lot of how our life is. What we think is minor sometimes isn't as minor as we like to think it is. It may affect people beyond certain points. We read it in the Old Testament, where a king will make a decision and suddenly just follows their line from that point forward. Or like the king who decided with Israel, he was afraid God was going to take the 10 tribes from him. So what does he do? He changes the holy days. He changes this. He becomes the high priest almost. I mean, not quite, but close enough. He makes the priest of the lowest, and that decision just dramatically changed Israel's history all the way through. So our decisions like that can be important, be big. We are called to be out of this world, or not out of this world. That'd be nice. That came out awkward. Mistake. We've been called out of this world. But since we have. Well, the way we have, not that kind of out of the world, but Ian and I were discussing it because I'm reading Revelation, and he's right. I probably need to find key scriptures to memorize. There's just too much in it. But one place I know it relates to this is Revelation 18, verse 4. We see, as the title in my Bible says, Babylon is fallen, as it also says in the notes. And he's talking about how, okay, in verse 2, fallen is Babylon the Great being the world system, as we understand it. That can be something I can go into another day, but we've been in the church for a long time, so we know this. She became a dwelling place for demons and a prison for every unclean spirit, and so forth, and goes on. It talks about the nations. Nations have drunk of the wine of her passions, of her immorality, and the kings have acted more. Then it goes on to verse 4. And then John says, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you may not participate in her sins or receive of her plagues. For her sins have piled up as high as the heavens, and God has remembered her iniquities. And then he goes so forth about punishing Babylon. The world system that's ahead of it that we see. And this world system does go against God, which we'll go into Daniel later. Now, just as a quick, just to make a contrast, there's two contrasts. We can look at how God did it. Remember it says, and I don't know where it's at, and if you all know it, you can just tell me in a minute. In Hebrews it says that they were, in the Old Testament, the people of the Old Testament were set for an example for us. So when you read, you realize that when Israel was released from Egypt, God set them up. This is God's way of handling things. He gives them laws. Now, some laws I kind of got confused at why they had to be told, like why you use the facilities away from the camp. Maybe they didn't care, maybe they were taught wrong, but who knows. And there's others like how to handle your neighbors, how to justify, if the laws are not over controlling. You just do what is right for your neighbor and yourself. Then in Judges you find out he gives land. He gave them land. This is your land. Okay, Manasseh, you go in here, you go attack, you take it over. This is your plot of land. You divide it amongst your families, and it's perpetual. And if you sell it, you got a 7-year, I think what's a year of jubilee or something, where you switch things back to where it was. So God gives us land. He gives us that. Minimum control. You don't see a king over Israel. God is the king. You see local authorities doing their thing, but then they have to work within God's laws, which keeps it semi-fair. I'm sure it wasn't perfect, because people don't stay perfect. That's the way it is. But it was better than what the world had, where you have a king who just looks at you and says, I don't like you. I say that, I'm not pointing at him and you that way. I was thinking of an example of one of the explorers who went to South Africa. The king wanted to show off how powerful he was. I forgot, it was one of the sailors, it was a missionary. He just pointed out in the crowd of his followers and picked that person. And he said, kill him. And the point was, because the missionary was shocked, and the point was the guy was saying he was showing his power. And he said, that's not showing power, that's just brutality. And he said, but he wanted you to see. And that's how, but God didn't want that. God has just rules, you have to, anyway, God gave just rules for Israel. You had to make sure there's 2 witnesses if there was a murder. If you cannot move a landmark, I can't just go up to if I had land in Tulsa, I can't just move the fence line 2 feet over and say that's good land, it's mine. That would have to be returned back to the neighbor. There was a story that somebody told me about at work, something like that, where somebody had misunderstood the landmark and built a garage over somebody's property. And the former owners were okay with it. They just, whatever, we don't care, we got plenty of land. The new owner suddenly went, we want that, we want that. And what's the guy who built the garage going to say? Well, it was on that property. But we go to 1 Samuel 8. So bottom line in all that was that God set them up a very nice system. The only taxes they had to pay was 10% to the high priest, so they could function more than anything else. Then he gave them land, he gives them righteous rules. He says, hey, just have children, I'll bless you, I'll give you rain, hey, all the stuff that's in there. And the funny thing is they weren't content. And I can see I never turned to this part of the air. Breaking in my new Bible still. We see in 2 Samuel 2, or 1 Samuel 8. Now it says, and it came about when Samuel was old, that he appointed his sons to rule over, and so forth. Okay, I'll just read it anyway. And the names of the firstborn were. But anyway, I was going to go to verse 4. So basically, we know that his sons did not perform the duties right, and so forth. Then in verse 4, and then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, behold, you have grown old. Your sons do not walk in your way. Now appoint us a king for us to judge us like all the nations. So they looked around the nations and went, hey, remember what it said, that people who don't want to take responsibility tends to like other people ruling? They didn't want to take the responsibility at that point. Verse 10. When he tells God, God says you did not, Samuel wasn't being rejected, it was God. And then God warns these people what a king is going to do. He says, now this goes into man's rule all of a sudden. See, God allowed them to have families, blessed them when they did what they were supposed to do. They had righteous laws. They could do, if somebody wronged somebody, let's say I wronged Rick, I accidentally did $50 away from them, God would require me to pay maybe $100 or something, just kind of as a object lesson, and go on, and then everybody's happy again. But it doesn't. In this case, they want a king, and it says, "This will be the procedure of a king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and he will run before his chariots." Draft. We see this. He'll draft your kids. One of the things that really got my grandmother really upset was, they were okay with World War II, but it stressed my grandmother, according to my mom, to see her uncle, well, actually they were just uncles and aunts, her brothers go overseas. One died in Germany flying over bombing. never came back. Alvin never came back. One went, her husband, my grandfather, went to the Pacific. Luckily he wasn't killed, but the war, that he was definitely a different person at the time. After the war, he from nice brown hair to almost what I have, gray. This is how almost it was described. And this is over a couple of year period. And he would not watch war movies anymore either. It was too realistic. In fact, I think my mom said it wasn't even realistic. It was just that he can envision the war. It had a psychological reaction. But the king is going to draw these people in. War is a part of life, but he's going to have chariots anyway. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and so forth. And then it says in 13, he will take your daughters for perfume cooks, perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and of your vineyards. See, God wouldn't do that. God said it's your land, and if you sell it, I think every jubilee, I think it is. You can correct me. I think it was supposed to all revert back to the way it was. So it's back to your land. So your kid sells the land at whatever, you're going to get it back. It's just a matter of time. And you can read the list, but he starts. You can read the list just for the sake of time. You can read, but he takes your children, he takes your people, and he starts taking land from you. He takes money, and I don't think we have to go much further in that because we see that in our government at present time. I know that when the Riverside Park was being built, the city decided your house is too close to the river. We'll give you pennies for the acre so you can just move out and go somewhere else. And these were homes from 1920 that had survived multiple floods. And they just said, nope, you got to leave. Here's a penny for the dollar and go on, get out. Daniel 7. There we go. Daniel 7. I'm not going into all of it. It talks about the successive kingdoms that are going. I've already spoke on this once before, and many of you have been in church forever know about the fact that let's see, get the notes out real quick. There you go. He has a vision. He sees a vision. He sees a lion. And that was supposed to be Nebuchadnezzar. He sees a bear. That's the Median Persian. He sees a leopard, which was Alexander the Great. You study him, yeah, he was like a leopard. I mean, he conquered the world so fast it wasn't funny. At 30-something years old, he died in a drunken, he just died of despair, is what a lot of people think. He may not have, but he died young. But he had owned a good chunk of the world at that point too. And then there's a fourth beast that comes out of nowhere. And that one is mentioned in Daniel 7, 19 through 21. Then I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of brass, and which devoured, crushed, trampled down, and the remains with its feet, and the meaning of the 10 horns, and those and so forth. He desired to know this. I'm going to use my notes. There we go. Talks about that, and then on verse 21, and as I watched, I saw the same horn make war with the saints. So this fourth kingdom is dreadful and terrible. It crushes everything. It's just like a government that has too much power. For example, I went to the Holocaust Museum recently, not the one in New York, even though that's what you said. There's a small one. There's in Tulsa. There's the Sherman something Jewish Museum. And they have a Holocaust, like a museum. And the Jews were targeted, but they said in the actual Holocaust thing, it wasn't just the Jews. There was Germans who actually stood up There was a sign that depicted in Munich in 1942. There was a bunch of young people in Munich who decided Hitler was just a trouble. So they printed it out. 2 days later, they were executed. I mean, the government just went in and went, nope, that ain't going to happen. As soon as the government got the pamphlet, they took them out, and then a couple of weeks later, they executed others. They did it very brutally. It's almost like the description of this beast, isn't it? It's like, no, it just stomps on everybody. And this is what the World War II and Germany will look like nothing compared to what's about to happen to us, or what's going to happen in the future. So we know it'll be worse. And then he said in verse 21, and I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints. In World War II, when Hitler made war with the Jews, it was steps. When you go in, as you head up to the second level, you see a display for Kristallnacht, and then you see they had to wear a badge. They can no longer teach. They can no longer hold public office. It was a steady pulling of freedoms. And then at the top is arrested and detained for whatever the law said. He made war. And the new beast power is going to make war on the saints. And he's going to prevail against them. Until the Ancient of Days comes and a judgment was made in the favor of the saints of the Most High, and in that time will come and the saints to possess the kingdom. So just like I read in Revelation when it says, here comes the trumpets, and the saints are going, when are you going to avenge our blood? Not now, we'll give you white robes. It's when your fellow brethren will also have to go through this. But someday, God will come down. He'll see it, and he'll be sick of it, and he'll get tired of it. And he's going to end it. He's going to liberate not just us, because we're liberated in a sense of, we're liberated from our sins. We're liberated from some of our sickness. We've seen healing in our churches. We've seen that. We've been liberated mentally with freedom. And then eventually, God's going to liberate the entire world. And the liberation is going to be wonderful. Because it says in Isaiah, I'm not going to Isaiah. I mean, I could go to Isaiah, but go to Isaiah. I can always quote into that when I need to. In Isaiah, we're going to hear about a lot of this. Isaiah 2, 1 through 4. So as we read in Daniel, he says, until the Ancient of Days came and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. So God will start up a kingdom. He will liberate us, all of us, all mankind, from Satan, ourselves. And he said, and in Isaiah 2, 1 through 4, the word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now it came to pass in the latter days, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. So it will be the center of the world, center of world power. Many people shall come say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his path. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he shall judge between the nations, and rebuke many nations. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And the day when, at the end of this, the day when I know some parents now that I know who have 18-year-old kids who are worried that we're going to put boots in Russia. I mean, not Russia. We might fight Russians, but in Ukraine, won't have to worry about it in the kingdom of God. No, there won't be war. God will judge it, take care of it. It's an instant issue resolved. As we would say in Coca-Cola when I worked there and on the phone, is your issue resolved? Thank you. Yeah. And in Micah 4:1-4, it says, "And they shall sit under their own vine tree or vine tree." I got it right. Fig tree. I knew I got it wrong because vines and they shall not fear anymore, which is not true in an inner city at all. Luckily, where I live, there's not much fear to fear, so to speak. But if I was to move 4 blocks down, I would probably have to do car alarms more and all that. God is here to liberate us. Just in conclusion, God is here to liberate us. He, like I said last week, 2 weeks ago in Hot Springs, He liberates us. He came to liberate the sick. He came to liberate those in captive in prison. That could be mental, that could be physical, that could be. Jesus came. He gave us the truth, which liberates us. We're free. We got the truth. He's doing this. He did this when He was alive. He's doing this now when He lets us read the Bible. We may not be liberated from the world system at the present time, but He's liberating us from it as we go. And as the system gets worse, we can't control it, and we may even be victims of it, like it says in the Bible sometimes. Like it says, hey, we were killed. What do you do? When are you going to avenge? I can't remember where that's at in Revelation, but I read it point blank. When will you avenge our blood? Because they didn't do anything. And He said, soon. When He comes, then He's going to liberate the world from Satan's influence, evil men's influence, and then He will give everybody, start teaching people how to live. And I bet the world, like we were discussing, you'll actually have a better world. You can have your own land, you have homegrown food. I mean, somewhere in the Bible it says that the sowers will outpace the reapers. If I got that direction right, did I, Ian? The sowers will there'll be so much food. God promises a world that will liberate mankind once and for all. And that's what we look for in 60 days at the Feast of Tabernacles.